The night air over the Solomon Islands is heavy and still. August 1943. Moonlight breaks through scattered cloud, silvering the tops of palm trees and the dark water beyond. Japanese soldiers crouch in silence along a jungle ridgeline. For months, night has been their ally. Darkness has meant movement, surprise, control. American patrols once froze after sunset, unsure, blind, waiting for dawn. But tonight is different. Somewhere beyond the trees, engines hum with quiet confidence. Artillery does not fire blindly, it lands with purpose. Machine gun bursts arrive not as probing shots, but as precise lines of death. Flares are unnecessary, searchlights never switch on. The Americans are moving as if they can see. Japanese observers exchange glances in the dark. Orders are whispered. Runners hesitate. The jungle, once a shield, now feels exposed. Every sound seems measured against them. Every step forward is anticipated. Unseen beams sweep the night sky. Invisible signals bounce off metal and flesh. What was once instinct and tradition is being replaced by something colder, something learned. And as the firing intensifies, a realization settles in. The night no longer belongs to them. That realization did not come suddenly. It was forged by months of pressure, failure, and adaptation that reshaped the Pacific War itself.
Before the war in the Pacific ever reached its decisive battles, the Imperial Japanese military believed it already possessed a natural advantage. It was not a weapon, nor a ship, nor an aircraft. It was the night. For decades, Japanese Army and naval doctrine placed heavy emphasis on operating after dark. This focus was shaped by geography, experience, and philosophy. Japan's military leaders understood that their nation lacked the industrial depth of Western powers. Victory, therefore, would depend on skill, surprise, and psychological dominance rather than sustained material superiority. Night fighting fit this belief perfectly. Japanese soldiers trained extensively in low-light conditions. Infantry units rehearsed silent movement, infiltration, and sudden close-range assaults. Bayonet charges at night were not rare exercises, but expected battlefield maneuvers. Soldiers were taught to read the environment by sound and shadow, to move without flashlights, and to trust instinct over instruments. Officers emphasized initiative at the small unit level, encouraging junior leaders to act independently once contact was made. This doctrine had been tested long before American forces entered the war. During the Second Sino-Japanese War, beginning in 1937, Japanese units repeatedly used night attacks to dislocate and demoralize Chinese defenders. Poorly equipped opponents often broke under the strain of darkness, confusion, and sudden violence. These experiences reinforced Japanese confidence. Reports circulated through military academies and staff colleges, praising night operations as uniquely suited to the Japanese soldiers' discipline and spirit. By contrast, Western armies were perceived as rigid and dependent on visibility, schedules, and centralized command. When war erupted in December 1941, early engagements appeared to validate these assumptions. In Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, Japanese forces advanced rapidly. Night landings, night marches, and surprise assaults consistently outpaced Allied responses. The psychological effect was severe. Troops unaccustomed to fighting in darkness felt hunted rather than engaged. Nowhere was this imbalance more visible than in the first months of the Guadalcanal campaign in 1942. Japanese naval forces, particularly destroyer squadrons operating in the waters later nicknamed Iron Bottom Sound, conducted repeated nighttime bombardments and troop runs. These missions, collectively known as the Tokyo Express, relied on speed, coordination, and darkness to avoid American air power and disrupt ground forces. Japanese ships approached, fired, and withdrew before daylight, often with devastating effect.
On land, Japanese infantry continued to exploit the night. American Marines, newly arrived and under-equipped, struggled to establish perimeter security after sunset. Reports from the early weeks of the campaign described confusion, friendly fire incidents, and an ever-present sense of vulnerability once daylight faded. American doctrine at the time did little to help. Pre-war U.S. training emphasized daylight engagements, firepower coordination, and methodical advance. Night operations were considered risky and were generally avoided unless unavoidable. Communication equipment was limited, illumination was crude, coordination between units after dark was unreliable at best. The result was a stark contrast in confidence. Japanese soldiers expected to dominate the night. American troops endured it. But Guadalcanal did not end quickly. It became a grinding contest of endurance. As weeks turned into months, American forces were forced to confront their deficiencies repeatedly. Each night engagement became a lesson written in casualties in after-action reports. Commanders began to understand that survival in the Pacific required not just bravery, but adaptation. Meanwhile, the Japanese command drew its own conclusions. They observed that while American troops were initially hesitant at night, they were not static. Defensive positions improved, patrols became more aggressive, small unit coordination showed signs of learning. What had once been panic was slowly replaced by procedure. Still, Japanese confidence remained high. Doctrine, tradition, and early success all pointed in the same direction. The night was a proven domain, shaped by years of training and reinforced by experience. There was little reason at first to believe this advantage could be taken away. Yet, even as Japanese units relied on instinct and inherited methods, something new was forming beyond the jungle and the waves. It did not depend on eyesight or tradition. It depended on electronics, mathematics, and relentless training cycles. The transformation had already begun, quietly, far from the front lines, and it would soon reshape the very nature of fighting after dark.
While Japanese forces continued to rely on doctrine refined through experience, the United States approached the problem of night fighting from a different direction. For American planners, the early failures of 1942 were not philosophical crises. They were technical and organizational problems, and therefore solvable. The foundation for change had been laid even before Pearl Harbor. In 1940, as war engulfed Europe, American military observers closely studied British survival against German air and naval power. One lesson stood above all others: radar. British early warning systems had proven decisive during the Battle of Britain, transforming the night sky from a realm of uncertainty into one of detection and response. Recognizing its potential, the United States accelerated cooperation with British scientists, sharing designs, data, and operational lessons. By the time American forces entered the Pacific War, radar was no longer experimental. It was a growing system, adaptable to ships, aircraft, and eventually ground units. Naval radar developed fastest. Shipborne surface search and fire control radar allowed American vessels to detect contacts well beyond visual range, even in total darkness. Early sets were imperfect, prone to clutter, weather interference, and operator error, but they offered something revolutionary: awareness without sight. At first, commanders were skeptical. Many senior officers had spent careers relying on visual identification and instinctive judgment. Trusting a glowing screen over the bridge window did not come naturally, but the brutality of early night engagements, particularly in the waters around Guadalcanal, forced change. Losses mounted. After-action reports revealed a pattern. Japanese ships were appearing, striking, and vanishing before American forces could respond effectively. The problem was not courage, it was detection and coordination. Training programs adjusted accordingly. Radar operators were no longer treated as technicians in the background. They became integral members of the command team. Bridge crews trained to integrate radar data with maneuvering orders. Fire control systems were modified to accept radar inputs, allowing guns to be laid on targets that were never seen by the naked eye. On land, the transformation was slower, but no less significant. The U.S. Army and Marine Corps began revising infantry doctrine to account for prolonged night combat. Units trained specifically for nighttime patrols, perimeter defense, and counter-infiltration. Firing disciplines were enforced. Listening posts and overlapping fields of fire replaced static reliance on flares and searchlights. Communication procedures were standardized to reduce confusion and darkness. Crucially, training emphasized repetition. American units cycled through night exercises again and again, simulating contact under low visibility until actions became instinctive. Unlike Japanese doctrine, which emphasized individual initiative rooted in tradition, American training focused on collective procedure reinforced by technology. Radios, field telephones, and later portable radar sets linked small units to higher command even after sunset. This shift extended into the air as well. Night fighter squadrons were formed and equipped with airborne interception radar. Pilots trained to track targets by instrument alone, guided by ground controllers who could see enemy aircraft through electronic returns. This system-based approach contrasted sharply with Japanese reliance on visual interception and pilot experience. Japanese intelligence became increasingly aware of these changes, but understanding lagged behind observation. Captured documents and post-war testimony revealed that Japanese commanders noticed American improvements without fully grasping their cause. Reports described American ships opening fire accurately at night without illumination. Infantry units seemed prepared for infiltration attempts that once succeeded easily. Patrols operated confidently in darkness, probing Japanese positions rather than avoiding contact. Some Japanese officers attributed this to increased experience. Others suspected new equipment, but radar remained an abstract concept. Japanese radar development existed, but production limitations, resource shortages, and doctrinal resistance hindered widespread deployment. Where radar was available, it was often inferior in range and reliability. More importantly, Japanese doctrine struggled to adapt. Night fighting had become a cultural strength tied to identity and training philosophy. To admit that technology could neutralize it was to challenge deeply held assumptions about the nature of combat. As a result, adaptation was uneven and slow. By late 1943, the balance of night combat in the Pacific was no longer fixed. Darkness still concealed movement and masked sound, but it no longer guaranteed advantage. One side was learning to see without seeing, to coordinate without light, and to impose order where chaos once ruled. Japanese soldiers on the front line sensed this shift first. They did not read technical manuals or intelligence summaries. They felt it in the timing of artillery, the accuracy of machine gun fire, and the confidence of American patrols moving through the jungle after sunset. What had once been instinctive dominance was becoming contested space, and soon it would become something else entirely. The change did not unfold along a single line. It revealed itself through multiple perspectives, each exposing a different layer of the transformation taking place in the dark.
For Japanese soldiers conditioned to expect superiority after sunset, the first encounters with improved American night fighting were deeply unsettling. Night had always reduced uncertainty. It simplified the battlefield. Sound replaced sight. Surprise replaced prolonged engagement. But as American fire became more precise and coordinated, that simplicity vanished. Patrols advancing through jungle paths found themselves illuminated not by flares, but by sudden, accurate fire. Machine guns opened up along anticipated routes. Mortars fell with uncanny timing. The familiar rhythm of night movement, advance, strike, withdraw, was disrupted by resistance that felt prepared rather than reactive. Survivor accounts and post-war interviews reveal confusion more than fear.
Soldiers questioned how Americans could respond so quickly. Some believed they had been betrayed by informants. Others suspected luck. Few immediately grasped the presence of unseen systems guiding the enemy's actions. This uncertainty eroded confidence. The night, once a comfort, became unpredictable. Japanese units hesitated longer before moving. Reconnaissance took more time. Momentum slowed. The psychological edge that night operations once provided began to dull, replaced by caution where boldness had once thrived. Radar did not simply extend vision, it reshaped decision-making. American commanders no longer waited for visual confirmation to act. They responded to contacts plotted as symbols and ranges, trusting operators trained to interpret returns accurately. At sea, this meant American ships could detect Japanese formations long before gun flashes revealed them. Fire could be opened from beyond visual range, denying Japanese crews the element of surprise they relied upon. On land, radar-supported artillery and early warning systems allowed defensive positions to brace before contact occurred. Japanese forces, lacking comparable systems at scale, were forced to rely on traditional observation. Human eyesight, even trained, could not compete with electronic detection. The result was asymmetry. One side acted on anticipation, the other reacted to impact. This technological imbalance did not require overwhelming numbers, it required integration. Radar, radios, and training combined into a system that compressed decision time and expanded awareness, quietly redefining what night meant on the battlefield. American improvement was not accidental, it was drilled. Night exercises became routine rather than exceptional. Units practiced movement, firing, and communication until procedures replaced hesitation. Soldiers learned when to shoot, when to hold fire, and how to distinguish enemy movement from their own. Commanders rehearsed coordination under low visibility, refining responses through repetition. This training did more than improve performance, it built trust. Trust in equipment, trust in leadership, trust that the system would function even when individual perception failed. Japanese observers noticed this change. American units no longer avoided night contact, they sought it selectively. Patrols probed forward positions, ambushes were planned rather than improvised. The night ceased to be a period of endurance and became an extension of daytime operations. Yet technology and training alone did not explain the shift. Decisions at the highest levels shaped how these tools were used and how quickly they transformed combat after dark.
The transformation of American night fighting depended not only on equipment or training, but on leadership willing to abandon tradition. Senior commanders had to accept that intuition and eyesight were no longer sufficient. Decisions would be made based on data, often imperfect, arriving from radar operators and communications specialists rather than from the bridge or the front line. This shift required humility. Experienced officers learned to trust younger specialists interpreting screens and signals. Command structures adapted, integrating radar information directly into tactical planning. At sea, task force commanders began issuing orders based on electronic plots. On land, perimeter defenses and counterattacks were shaped by early warning rather than sudden contact. Japanese leaders observed the effects without always recognizing the cause. Engagements that once followed predictable patterns now unfolded with American forces acting first. Surprise changed direction. Initiative shifted. The difference lay not in aggressiveness, but in confidence grounded in unseen awareness. Japanese forces did not remain static in the face of change. Some units adjusted movement patterns, reducing noise and dispersing formations. Others attempted to strike earlier in the evening or during periods of poor weather, hoping to negate American detection. Radar countermeasures were discussed, but practical solutions were limited. Japanese radar production lagged, and integration into Doctrine proved difficult. Even when equipment was available, training shortages and logistical strain prevented widespread effectiveness. Intelligence officers compiled reports noting American accuracy at night. Some concluded that radar must be involved, but resources to counter it were scarce. As the war progressed, Japanese adaptation became reactive rather than proactive, constrained by industrial limits and strategic pressure. Perhaps the most profound challenge was doctrinal. Japanese night fighting was more than a tactic, it was an expression of military identity. It reinforced beliefs about spirit, discipline, and superiority through skill rather than machinery. American night fighting represented the opposite philosophy. It was systematic, procedural, dependent on coordination between humans and machines. As American effectiveness increased, the contrast became undeniable. The night no longer rewarded courage alone. It favored preparation, communication, and technological integration. For Japanese soldiers and commanders alike, this realization struck at the foundation of pre-war assumptions. By late 1943, both sides understood that the contest for the night was no longer theoretical. It would be decided in specific battles, under exact conditions, where detection, timing, and coordination determined survival. The turning point was approaching, not as a single moment, but as a series of engagements where darkness itself changed sides. The decisive transformation of night combat in the Pacific was not sudden. It was carved battle by battle, island by island. August and September 1942 had already shown the strain, but by late 1943, the American system reached a tipping point. Guadalcanal, the Solomons, and the surrounding seas became laboratories of this new warfare. In the early hours before midnight, American task forces patrolled waters Japanese commanders had long considered safe. Radar screens glowed dimly in the bridges of cruisers and destroyers. Operators tracked Japanese ships approaching along predictable routes. Orders were transmitted with precision, directing gunners to bearings the human eye could not see. When the Japanese ships arrived, expecting the familiar pattern of surprise and fleeting advantage, they encountered coordinated volleys of fire. Torpedoes were launched in response, but radar-directed gunfire struck first. Japanese formations scattered under fire that seemed to anticipate every maneuver. On land, the situation mirrored the sea. In jungle ridgelines around Guadalcanal, Japanese infantry probing American positions after dark were met with pre-aimed machine gun fire, mortars landing exactly where reconnaissance predicted, and flares coordinated to illuminate targets only after action had begun. Patrols that once operated with impunity found themselves trapped in intersecting fields of fire. The psychological effect was immediate. Japanese soldiers had trained for months to read the jungle at night, to interpret sound and shadow. Now their training was irrelevant. Every step forward carried risk, not from chance, but from unseen systems that anticipated their movement. American commanders, by contrast, acted with a confidence previously impossible in darkness. Radar screens allowed them to concentrate firepower efficiently. Units executed pre-planned maneuvers. Coordination between ships and aircraft, between infantry and artillery, achieved a level of synchronization that transformed night into a controlled battlefield rather than a chaotic one. Japanese reports from these engagements describe confusion and disbelief. Destroyer captains noted incoming fire from unknown positions, while infantry diaries record the feeling of being hunted rather than hunting. Leadership at every level struggled to reconcile doctrine with reality. One night in November 1943, during a naval engagement near Bougainville, radar-equipped American ships detected a Japanese supply convoy moving under cover of darkness. The Americans tracked every vessel's course. Guns opened at ranges previously impossible at night. Torpedoes and gunfire combined to decimate the formation. Japanese observers later recorded that the attack could not have been anticipated. It was in these encounters that the balance decisively shifted. The night was no longer a neutral element or a Japanese sanctuary. It had become an instrument wielded by Americans trained to exploit every technological advantage and procedural lesson. Yet the turning point was not complete. The Japanese continued to resist, to adapt, and to fight with skill rooted in experience. Losses were severe, but not catastrophic. The real climax would emerge when American integration of radar, training, and leadership reached its full operational effect, an apex that left the Japanese night doctrine shattered in practice. By early 1944, the lessons of Guadalcanal and the Solomons had matured into a systematic American approach. Night fighting was no longer improvisation, it was doctrine, honed through repeated engagements and supported by technology. Every unit, from aircraft to destroyers, knew its role. Every operator understood the rhythm of detection, communication, and fire. The Battle of Cape St. George, November 25, 1943, exemplified this transformation. A task force of 5 American destroyers, led by Captain Arleigh Burke, intercepted a Japanese force attempting a nocturnal evacuation of troops from Buka Island. Radar allowed the Americans to locate the enemy at 16,000 yards, well beyond visual detection. Without illumination, without surprise flares, the American ships maneuvered into optimal firing positions. Within minutes, torpedoes and gunfire struck Japanese vessels in rapid succession. 3 destroyers were sunk, others damaged, with no American casualties. Japanese reports described the encounter as incomprehensible, the Americans moving as if guided by a sixth sense. Post-war analysis confirmed the role of radar-directed tactics, meticulous planning, and practiced coordination. On land, similar transformations were evident. At Bougainville, American forces reorganized defensive perimeters using early warning devices in pre-calculated fields of fire. Japanese infiltration attempts were anticipated. Patrols moving under cover of darkness were engaged before they reached the American lines. The jungle no longer concealed movement, it revealed it, when interpreted through instruments and disciplined procedures. The cumulative effect was catastrophic for Japanese tactical doctrine. Units that had once counted on the night for mobility and surprise now faced lethal detection and disciplined countermeasures. Morale suffered. Officers faced difficult decisions: attempt attacks and risk annihilation, or avoid contact and concede initiative. Both options carried cost. Even as Japanese forces attempted evasive maneuvers, they could not match the American system. Radar-equipped ships could shadow convoys. Airborne fighters could intercept under guidance from ground-based controllers. Artillery and machine gun networks on islands could strike with precision before visual identification. The old rules of engagement, skill, stealth, and courage, were insufficient against a force that could see without seeing. The decisive turning point was not a single moment of annihilation, but a cumulative realization. Japanese soldiers, from frontline infantry to naval officers, recognized that their mastery of darkness had been neutralized. Night was no longer a friend, it had become an enemy instrument, wielded by Americans who combined intellect, technology, and relentless practice. By early 1944, the night war in the Pacific had fundamentally changed. Japanese forces could still fight, but they could no longer dominate after sunset. The very element that had symbolized their ingenuity, discipline, and martial culture had been stripped away. And as the smoke cleared over the Solomons, the Pacific became a theater where darkness was no longer an advantage. It was simply another battlefield to be mastered or endured. The consequences of this shift in night fighting reverberated immediately across the Pacific. Japanese forces were no longer able to rely on darkness as a protective cloak or a tactical multiplier. The attrition of experienced troops, combined with the psychological weight of constant exposure, began to erode effectiveness. Night operations that had once allowed rapid troop movements and surprise attacks now resulted in confusion, losses, and missed objectives. Naval engagements illustrated the stark contrast. By early 1944, Japanese destroyer squadrons that had once run supplies and troops under cover of darkness, operations collectively known as the Tokyo Express, found themselves vulnerable at every stage. Ships were intercepted before landing troops. Convoys were detected far earlier than anticipated, allowing American forces to concentrate firepower with devastating effect. In reports, Japanese captains admitted that the enemy sees before we move, a statement that, at the time, conveyed both fear and disbelief. Casualty reports from these months provide grim evidence. In the Solomons, Japanese destroyer losses outpaced the number of vessels delivered to the front lines. Infantry units attempting night infiltration suffered higher rates of casualties than daytime assaults in comparable terrain. Each loss was compounded by the difficulty of replacing trained personnel, a problem magnified by the strategic and logistical limitations of Japan's wartime industry. Meanwhile, American forces consolidated their new capabilities. Radar had moved from experimental to operational standard. Night patrols were routinely conducted, and offensive operations were planned around the ability to detect and engage the enemy without relying on visual confirmation. Ships, aircraft, and ground units operated with unprecedented coordination. Even inexperienced crews benefited from the system. Proper training and doctrine allowed technology to compensate for gaps in experience. Beyond raw numbers, the psychological impact on Japanese troops was significant. Diaries and post-war memoirs reveal growing anxiety during nocturnal operations. Where soldiers once moved confidently under the cover of darkness, they now hesitated. Commanders found that orders relying on stealth or surprise were increasingly risky. Morale suffered as units adjusted to a new reality. The night no longer belonged to them, and every movement could be observed, tracked, and countered. The shift also forced a re-evaluation within Japanese high command. The Imperial Navy and Army both recognized that reliance on night operations, previously considered a cornerstone of strategy, could no longer guarantee advantage. Efforts to counter American radar were underway, but production limitations and doctrinal rigidity meant solutions would lag behind operational necessity. Strategically, the American mastery of night operations contributed directly to a growing imbalance in the Pacific. Naval superiority increasingly favored forces capable of operating effectively after dark. Ground campaigns were safer for Allied troops who could maneuver without fear of unseen attacks. Japanese forces were forced to fight under conditions chosen by the Americans, rather than exploiting darkness on their own terms. In essence, the Pacific theater entered a new phase. The technological and procedural integration of night fighting by the United States transformed not only individual battles, but the broader approach to operations. The advantage that had long belonged to Japanese forces was gone, and with it, a cornerstone of their tactical identity. The long-term consequences of America's mastery of night combat were both operational and psychological. By mid-1944, Japanese commanders openly acknowledged the shift in reports. Night no longer allowed for initiative. It had become a domain controlled by the Americans. Their previously trusted doctrine, built on surprise, stealth, and discipline, was effectively neutralized. Casualties continued to mount. Destroyer squadrons operating in the Solomons and Bougainville lost ships at alarming rates. Infantry units attempting night infiltration or counterattacks suffered disproportionately, often encountering pre-aimed machine gun fire or mortar barrages guided by early warning systems. The cumulative effect was a shrinking pool of experienced soldiers and sailors capable of executing complex operations, a problem Japan could not rectify due to industrial and logistical constraints. American forces, conversely, solidified confidence in night operations. Radar integration became routine. Combined arms coordination, ships, aircraft, and ground units allowed the United States to dictate engagements on its terms. Training, technology, and doctrine created a force that could operate continuously, day or night, without fear of surprise. Where darkness had once concealed and protected, it now offered no sanctuary. Psychologically, the impact on Japanese troops was profound. Diaries and post-war testimonies reflect a shift from confidence to caution. Night attacks were no longer bold maneuvers, but high-risk operations. Troops hesitated. Officers doubted whether traditional tactics could succeed. Even veteran soldiers, once confident in their mastery of stealth and terrain, were forced to confront an enemy that could see without light, anticipate their moves, and strike with precision. At the strategic level, the Pacific War increasingly favored forces that could exploit technological advantage. Radar-directed night operations allowed American commanders to maintain initiative, shape battle conditions, and preserve their own forces while inflicting disproportionate losses on the Japanese. The industrial and scientific capacity of the United States, once a latent advantage, had now become operational reality. Japanese attempts to adapt were constrained by more than technology. Doctrine, culture, and pre-existing beliefs about the nature of combat limited rapid change. The traditional emphasis on courage, initiative, and training under darkness could not compensate for the loss of surprise and situational awareness. Where Japanese forces once imposed their will after sunset, they now reacted under continuous observation. By the end of 1944, the consequences were clear. The night, once a symbol of Japanese ingenuity and tactical superiority, had become an instrument wielded by their opponent. The American mastery of night fighting did not merely level the playing field, it rewrote the rules of engagement in the Pacific. Darkness, the last stronghold of Japanese tactical confidence, was gone, leaving a theater dominated by preparation, coordination, and technological edge. The stage was set for the final phases of the Pacific War, where operational superiority rested as much on mastery of the invisible and the unseen as it did on firepower and numbers. What Japanese soldiers had once relied on instinctively was now systematically neutralized, and the psychological and strategic consequences would echo through every subsequent engagement. Night, once a sanctuary, had been transformed into a battlefield visible to those who could harness technology and training. For Japanese soldiers, the darkness that had long offered cover, control, and confidence became an unpredictable space where every step could be anticipated and every movement observed. This shift was not the result of luck or brute force, it was the product of deliberate adaptation. Radar systems refined through science, training repeated until instinct merged with procedure, and commanders willing to trust instruments over intuition. The United States had not simply caught up, it had redefined the rules of night warfare. For the Japanese, the consequences were profound. A doctrine forged over decades, tested in China and early Pacific victories, was rendered insufficient. Experience and courage, once decisive under darkness, could no longer guarantee survival or success. Morale and initiative eroded as every nocturnal maneuver risked exposure to unseen eyes and pre-aimed fire. For history, the lesson was clear. Warfare had entered a new era. The invisible could dominate the visible. Mastery of the night, once a natural advantage, required technology, coordination, and rigorous training to sustain. The battlefields of the Pacific demonstrated that human ingenuity, supported by scientific innovation, could overturn centuries of tactical assumptions. In the quiet aftermath, Japanese soldiers who had once ruled the night could only watch as their former advantage vanished. And in that vanishing, the Pacific War itself was irrevocably altered. Night was no longer a refuge, it was simply another battlefield, one that could be mastered, measured, and controlled. The darkness had changed hands, and with it, the very nature of modern warfare.